Hi everyone, thanks for visiting my channel today. If you are new here, welcome. I'm Carol and I'm so glad that you stopped by. So today we are going to be going back to canning. I did take a little bit of a break and did some sourdough recipes for you, and now we're going to get back into the groove of canning some things. And a hot item seems to be home canned Rotel. If you are in my Facebook group, you know that home canned Rotel has been a topic of discussion, and part of the reason for that is because there are no tested recipes for Rotel as we know it. Rotel, if you read the back of the can, is just tomatoes, water, green chilies, and then some seasoning, salt, citric acid. They do use calcium chloride, some natural flavoring. They don't tell you what they seasoned it with exactly, and then cilantro. So pretty basic stuff. There are no tested recipes that I could find, or that many of you could find, that are just those ingredients. There's tons of recipes for different types of salsa, but they include other ingredients that are not traditionally in Rotel. So I've been on a mission to find a recipe that is as similar to Rotel as we can get, and one that we can safely tweak so that we can do home canned Rotel and have it be very similar to what we're used to purchasing in the can. And I think that I have found a solution. There is a recipe in the all new Ball Book of Canning called Salsa Ranchera. And even though it's a salsa, it has the basic ingredients in it that are in Rotel. Now, this recipe does include onion, but we're gonna leave the onion out. Now, before we get started with the tweaking part, I do wanna say this is a water bath or steam canning recipe, and you wanna be careful when you are tweaking those types of recipes because acidity is really important to the safety of what you're canning. So in water bath canning recipes, it's safe to leave ingredients out as long as it's not an acid. So it's safe to leave things out, but it's not safe to add things. Once you start adding, especially because usually like a salsa is a combination of high acid and low acid foods, the acidity is really important. You have to have the right balance to keep it safe to be shelf stable. So we don't want to do too much tweaking, but it is safe to leave ingredients out, but you never want to add. And in many canning books for recipes of this nature, they will say, do not add more. And it really means do not add more. So we can safely leave out the onions here. Now, there is a recipe on the internet where they have used, I believe it's called Minnesota mix, which is tomatoes, green bell pepper, onions, and celery canned together. And they've taken that recipe and turned it into Rotel, and they have, even though they left out the onions and the celery, they did add more peppers, but still felt that it was safe to do that because they weren't changing the total amount of low acid food. They were keeping it the same amount, but they were taking away one low acid food and adding more of another. I'm not going to say that that's wrong, but I am going to point out that that is not an approved or tested method. So is it safe to do that? Possibly. Do we know that for sure? No, and it is certainly not recommended. So I'm not going to say that recipe is wrong, but I think we need to be careful doing that. So I'm not adding any more of anything. I'm just taking away. So please use caution when you are tweaking recipes that include both low acid and high acid foods in your water bath canning them. So there's my caution on that. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here is this recipe is also found in the Complete Book of Home Preserving, and it's also by Ball. They're basically the same recipe in that they contain basically the same ingredients. They use a little bit different methods, so if you have either one of these books, you can use either recipe. The method is pretty much the same. Now, in the Complete Book of Home Canning, they do give you the option of acidifying with citric acid, which is what we are going to use here because that is traditional in Rotel. In the recipe from the all new Ball Book, it is the same recipe is acidified using lime juice. But I'm going to swap out the lime juice and use citric acid. And I know that it's safe to do that, and I will leave my source as to why we can do that safely. I will leave that in the description box below. So the ingredients, I hope I haven't caused any confusion, but the ingredients are plum tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, garlic cloves, onion. We're gonna leave that out. That's not traditional in Rotel. Salt, chopped fresh cilantro, and then your lime juice. Now cilantro is in Rotel, so I'm going to leave that in. I'm going to remove the lime juice. They are using 1/3 cup of lime juice to acidify this recipe. So you have to do a little bit of canning math. 1/3 cup of lime juice or lemon juice is approximately 5 tablespoons plus a teaspoon. If you convert that to what you need in citric acid, when you convert that, it's going to be about 1.5 teaspoons. I'm rounding up because it's typically 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid is equivalent to 1 tablespoon of lemon or lime juice. So when you are converting it, 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid is the equivalent of 1 tablespoon of lemon or lime juice. So that's how I came up with my math. And I double checked it several times just to make sure that I was right, because I don't want to make a mistake. So to get started, we want to roast most of our ingredients in the oven. The plum tomatoes, you just need to core them. And then your peppers, it calls for 3/4 pound of jalapeno peppers. Now here's another safe swap that I'm doing. Peppers are safely switched out. They recommend using jalapeno peppers. I'm using 3 jalapeno peppers and 1 Anaheim pepper. Jalapenos can pack a lot of heat, and I don't want so much heat, so I'm still using 3/4 pound. I'm not changing the amount, but I am going to use an Anaheim pepper in place of some of the jalapenos just to tone down the heat a bit. And then our garlic cloves, and if you were using onion, you would also roast it. So I have my garlic cloves, my tomatoes, and my peppers on a baking sheet. I'm going to pop them in a preheated 425-degree oven for 20 minutes, and then they want you to remove the garlic and then bake it 20 minutes more, or until your vegetables are very soft and beginning to char. The reason why they want you to remove the garlic is because garlic, if it burns, becomes bitter, and we don't want that. So that's where we are now. I'm gonna pop it in the oven, let my ingredients start to roast, and then I will bring you back and we will continue with the process of our Rotel tomatoes. Okay guys, I've roasted my vegetables for the appropriate amount of time. It's a total of about 40 minutes, but you want them to start to char on the outside. I did turn my tomatoes over halfway through when I took the garlic out. Now their instructions are to put your peppers in a bowl and cover it with plastic wrap. And we're gonna let them steam for about 15 minutes so that we can peel them. And I'm gonna let my tomatoes cool for a few minutes, and then I'm going to peel them and roughly chop them. Okay guys, once my tomatoes were nicely roasted and the peppers were nicely roasted, like I showed you, we went ahead and put the peppers in a bowl, and I covered them with plastic wrap and let them sit for approximately 15 minutes and steam so that the skins could be removed. And then I let my tomatoes cool until they were cool enough that I could peel them. Once they were cool enough, I went ahead and peeled the peeling off. And if you are a dehydrator, you can save your peelings and dehydrate them and then grind them up, and they add great flavor to many dishes. Just a little tip there. But once you remove the skins, you want to coarsely chop your tomatoes and then go ahead and put them in a saucepan. Make sure you include as much of the juice as possible that comes off on your cutting board. For the peppers, once they've steamed, you want to cut them in half, remove the seeds and membranes if you don't want all that heat, and then peel them as well, and then you are going to finely chop them. I also finely chopped my garlic. So that's where we are right now. So now we are ready to add our seasonings. At this point, all we have to do is bring it up to a boil and then simmer it, reduce the heat and simmer it for 2 minutes. But we need to go ahead and add our spices. I have my canner warming up. I am going to be steam canning, but it's appropriate to water bath or steam can this recipe. I have my rack in my canner, and I have 3 quarts of water that I'm bringing up to a simmer in the bottom of my canner. Make sure you follow whatever instructions come with the canner that you are using. If you're water bath canning, make sure that you have enough water in your canner to cover your jars by 1 inch. And you want it at a full rolling boil before you start your processing time. Speaking of jars, this recipe was written for pint jars. Ball states that this recipe should make approximately 4 pints. I highly doubt that, but as it goes with Ball, many times they're off according to what I get. But I am going to be canning this in half pints. I don't ever use a pint of Rotel, so I'm going to be using the quilted jelly jars that are 8 ounces. So the processing time, we'll still use the 20 minutes processing time that would be appropriate for pints or half pints. You can always go down in size, but you cannot go up in size. So I do not have any processing times for doing this in quarts. So you're stuck with pints or half pints. So let's add some seasonings here. I am going to add, the recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of salt. I'm using 2 teaspoons of pickling and canning salt. It does not state to use any other spices, but when you look on the back of the Rotel can, it does say they've used other flavors, but they don't state what, so I'm going to go by what I like. I'm going to add about 1/4 teaspoon of ground coriander. That's just a nice, it's basically cilantro ground up, so that will work well here. I'm going to use about 1/4 teaspoon of smoked paprika. And I will list everything I'm using in the description box below. You don't have to add anything additional if you choose not to. I'm also going to add about 1/2 teaspoon of Mexican oregano. If you've hung around my channel for any of my Mexican dishes, you know that I really enjoy Mexican oregano. It is just beautiful in Mexican cooking, so and you can't get that flavor any other way. So I highly recommend it. And then I'm going to use about 1/4 teaspoon of cumin. I don't want too much of a smoky flavor here, but I do want a little bit. And then we are going to replace our lime juice. The 1/3 cup of lime juice is getting replaced with citric acid. So I talked about the math that I did earlier. So we need 1.5 teaspoons of citric acid. And then we are going to just give that a stir. I'm going to taste it, see if I want to adjust any of my seasonings. But this looks spot on for Rotel. The ratio of tomatoes to peppers is perfect. So I think Ball did a great job, even though they were making a different salsa with it. This recipe is going to work well for our purpose of making Rotel. I am going to add the fresh cilantro that is recommended in the salsa recipe by Ball. It is also listed on the can of Rotel. I'm not going to use as much as the recipe calls for. It calls for 1/2 cup. I'm going to use about half that amount. Cilantro is listed last on the can of Rotel. So they're not using a lot, but they are using some. So I have some fresh cilantro that I have chopped, and I'm only going to use about 1/4 cup. So now I'm going to bring it to a boil, simmer for 2 minutes, and then when I bring you back, we're going to can it up. Okay guys, here we go. 2 hot jars, hot clean jars. We are going to add our Rotel, and it tastes really good, you guys. I think that this is a perfect solution. So we are going to ladle them in our jars to 1/2 inch headspace. Once you get to the correct headspace, you're going to use a debubbling tool, chopstick, or plastic butter knife to release your air bubbles. If your headspace changes, you can top it off with a little bit more. Okay, once you're at the correct headspace, you're going to take a paper towel dipped in white vinegar to clean the rim of your jar. Center your lid. And then apply your bands to fingertip tight. Okay guys, I got 6 half-pint jars. So this would, leaving out the onion and the 1/3 of a cup of lime juice, decreased it by, they're saying about 4 pints. We got about a pint less. I had 6 half pints, plus I have about probably 4 ounces left. It's not enough to do another jar. So anyway, it'll get you close, but it's not going to be exactly what's in the ball book. So now we want to crank up our heat to high, put on the lid, oops, put the lid on to your canner, crank your heat up to high. If you're water bath canning, make sure your water covers your jars by at least 1 inch. If you are steam canning, make sure you have the appropriate amount of water in your canner. And once you are ready to start your processing time for steam canning, there's usually a dial gauge on top that will tell you when to start timing. For water bath canning, you want to be at a full rolling boil, and we are going to process for 20 minutes. Okay guys, we are all done. I processed for 20 minutes, and they've been cooling for about 5. So there you go. Homemade, home canned Rotel. You asked, you shall receive. So that was pretty easy, right? I think roasting, I love the roasting the tomatoes and the veggies. I think it adds a lot of flavor. And using the citric acid instead of the lime juice, we're not adding any flavor here really, and they taste pretty close to the to the canned version. So I hope you'll give it a try. I hope this answers all of your questions. I hope I didn't confuse anyone with the changes that I made, and you understand why we could make those changes and this still be a safe recipe. So if you have any questions for me, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Please like, subscribe, and share. Anytime you like and subscribe a video, it helps my channel and I appreciate it. Have a great day guys, and I will see you next time.